By now you should have a model that looks very much like this, with all the components, the solid plastic red component and your two hand grips, your grill at the back, and your heat shield on the top there. What we're going to do now is we're going to put some more detail into the main body component, this red component. We're going to put screw bosses in it to hold it together. We're going to shell it out, and we're going to split it into two individual components. The easiest thing to do is to hide these other components so that they're not going to get in the way. One other thing we need to do first is we need to create this little trigger control that's down the front there. So I'll hide the main body component there, and with this trigger I'm going to create a plane that runs through this front face of the control of the trigger, so that I can then create a sketch and do a boss extrude towards the handle. So to create the trigger, I need to have a plane that runs along the front of the trigger area, so that I can create a plane that's perpendicular to our view at the moment, but will allow us to create a boss extrude to create that trigger area. So the easiest way of creating that plane where I want it to be is to make a sketch on the front plane, create a line that runs the length on the front of that trigger. And once we have that, go insert reference geometry plane, select that line, and then also select the front plane. So what that does is it will put a plane in that's perpendicular to the front plane. So you can see we've got two references here. First reference was that line, second reference was the front plane. It's defaulted to perpendicular because that's the only solution that those two selections will allow, and we have a plane that's in exactly the spot that we want it to be. So to create the trigger, I'll create a sketch on our newly made plane. I'm going to use this straight slot feature, and I'm going to run that like that. I think the width needs to be approximately 15, so I'll make that 15. And again, we can sort of drag and drop that into the right spot. Like all things, you really need to be putting proper dimensions on here, but I'm just skipping that so that we don't get bogged down with too much detail. Next step is to do a boss extrude, and the depth of this trigger is probably about 15 millimeters. So I'm going to start off with that. We can always adjust it later, but let's make that 15. And we need draft. So it's going in the wrong direction. Just flip the direction. So we want to draft outwards, and we probably want to have a draft of about 10 degrees. And that's what our trigger will look like. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention too, just going back to that feature, is it's very important to note that you don't click merge results. You may end up by merging your trigger with other solid bodies, and we don't want that to happen because the trigger needs to be a separate component. So make sure that's not clicked and everything will be good. So that's the last of the components that we're going to make at this stage. I'm just going to hide that component, and this is the bit that we're going to work on next. There are two things that need to be created here. One is a little recess for an LED, for a little window that LEDs are going to shine through, and the other is a series of screw recesses. So I'm going to create a sketch on the front plane that's going to be in the right spot for the little window. At the moment I can't see that. We're going to temporarily hide that body, and you see this is the little window that I'm talking about. So I'm just going to make a sketch on the front plane here, and I'm going to make another slot using the slot tool again. I'm going to make a slot that's that size. You can see that that's on the front plane, and of course that's not really where we want it to be. The cut needs to be on the outside surface. So go back to showing the body. And you can see we need to get that to cut into the outside surface. There's a lot of ways of doing this. I could have created a new plane that was outside the body and then done a cut extrude into the body, but doing it this way is a little bit easier because we already have the front plane. It just means less planes and less messiness. If I go to extrude cut, instead of starting the cut on the front plane and cutting outwards, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the from section and I'm going to go cut from the surface. I'm going to select this surface and then I can just do a blind cut 2 millimeters into the surface. Just need to change the direction, just make sure that that's cutting in the right way. See, that's out and that's in, and that will give us the recess that we want. We can do something similar, but not quite as extreme with the screw bosses. So again, create another sketch. And the first screw boss I'm going to create on here, and I'm going to make that a 6 millimeter diameter screw boss. Now again, I should be putting dimensions on these things, but I'm not because for speed. Because I'm going to have a series of holes that are all the same size, I can do cut and paste, so Control C, Control V, and we have another screw boss. Now I'm putting these screw bosses behind the other components. So this is where the heat shield goes over the top. So that's going to be hidden. I'm going to put another screw boss in here that's nicely hidden underneath the hand grip, and I'm going to put another one down here, and then a final one I'm going to put along the center line here that's hidden behind that little back grill section. When I go to do the cut extrude, again, I'm going to do an offset cut extrude because I want, instead of starting from the sketch plane, I'm going to use the offset option, and that offset is going to start 2 millimeters away from the front plane. So the reason why I'm doing that is because when I do the shell command, I want to have a little bit of material at the bottom of those screw bosses so that the screws have something to hold on to. Okay, now I'm going to do a cut extrude through all. Now we have to be very careful that the offset is in the same direction as the cut extrude. Otherwise, if it's round the other way, then we'll just cut all the way through the center of the part. Put some draft on there. We want to draft outwards. We don't want 10 degrees. 2 will be fine. And that's okay. Now this should be applied to both sides of the part. So I'm going to put in a mirror. I'm going to mirror that about the front plane. So select the front plane, and we might as well mirror that little window at the same time as well. And there we have it. Okay, one final thing to do before we create the shell feature is to remove this bit down the bottom. So there are 2 reasons for that. One is that we're going to have problems with the shell because these faces come into a very sharp point, and sharp points are notoriously difficult to shell out. We don't want that anyway because we want the hand grip to come down here, and we want to have a flexible cable strain relief here anyway, so we don't want that hard plastic there. I'm going to make a very simple cut extrude that will allow us to cut away this bit of plastic here. Sketch on the front plane, and I'm just very, very simply going to create a line that comes up through here to remove that bit of plastic. And create a cut extrude. So again, we can see in the sketch that this area here is going to be removed, and there'll be a little hole in there, which we'll add that in later. But that's all strain relief for the cable entry for the hairdryer. Obviously, this is where your hand goes, so that's the area. You don't need to be gripping it down there. Last thing to do is the shell command. So quite simply, we're going to have a shell, 2mm wall thickness. I want to remove that face and I want to remove that face. Hit OK, and we keep our fingers crossed to see if this is going to shell. Okay, now it's worked nicely. If you have problems with the shell, and that's not at all uncommon, look for areas like down here where you have small faces. We have a small face that's intersecting with another face, or you can have problems where you've got a screw boss here where this internal wall here gets a little bit too close to this other wall, and the software can't quite work out how to create material around those holes, so that can be a bit problematic sometimes. Final stage in this is to split this component into two. So I'm going to use the front plane to do that, and using the split command, so insert features split, just selected the front plane. I need to select the bodies that need to be split, that one there. Press cut bodies, and these are the bodies that I want to cut, and there we have it. We have two separate components. I can hide one of those and show you that that's what it looks like. I don't need this original sketch anymore, so I'm just going to hide that to clarify things. Now that's one of the components. Still needs to have some holes here to allow the screws through. The other thing it needs to have is a hole for the trigger that we created earlier. I'll just go back to that trigger, the trigger solid body. Now, there's a couple of things I could do. I could do a copy body and then subtract that from these two parts. But an easier way to do it is just to simply create a sketch on that face there, and using offset entities, I'm going to offset that by 0.5, and then I'm just going to do a simple cut extrude. So blind to about 15mm. That's the depth of the trigger. Put draft on it. Remember, there was 10 degrees of draft, and make sure it drafts outwards. So now that's cutting around everything that the trigger sits in with a gap of 0.5mm. Now here's the thing to be careful of. We need to select which bodies this is going to cut through. As it turns out, all the bodies that it interferes with other than the trigger. Now, if we select all bodies, it will cut the trigger away as well. We won't have the trigger. So we need to select the other bodies that it's going to cut into. So to do that, we can select them from the list of solid bodies up here. And we certainly want to have this component here. We want to have that component. In fact, we want to have all the components other than the trigger itself. So the trigger is this one here, which is the Boss Extrude 4. So we want to make sure that's deselected. And that should be right. So hit OK. I'll just show all those solid bodies and make sure that we've got things right. So show that. In fact, and that's all the components created. Next step, I'll show you how to separate those components into separate parts and then put them into an assembly.